Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive.
Absolutely. Always ready to dig into some fascinating material.
Well, today we're going to be exploring how marginalized groups in India are challenging inequality and, fighting for their rights.
A really important topic, and a complex one, too.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Especially with the set of sources you've given us. We've got like historical context and legal analyses and even some personal stories.
It's a real mix, but I think that's what makes this so interesting, getting to see the issue from all these different angles.
Totally. So where do we even begin with all of this?
Well, one thing that really jumps out from the sources is the Indian Constitution.
Okay, Constitution.
Yeah, it seems to be a really crucial tool for these marginalized groups, especially Articles 15 and 17. Those keep coming up.
Articles 15 and 17.
Ah.
Got it. So I guess my question then is, what makes those particular articles so powerful? Why are they so significant for these groups?
Well, they're incredibly targeted, like laser focused on very specific forms of discrimination.
Yep.
So, for example, Article 17, that directly abolishes untouchability.
Wow.
Yeah. Head on tackling that historical system that's had such a devastating impact on Dalit communities.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense.
And then you have Article 15, which broadens things out a bit. It prohibits discrimination based on religion, race, caste, sex, place of birth. So, it's kind of creating this broader shield against discrimination.
Ah, I see. So it's like Article 17 is very specific and 15 is more general, but they both work together.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. So it's not just like these vague statements about equality. They're actually concrete legal tools that people can use.
Precisely.
Okay, so then how are these articles being used in practice? Like, can you give us some concrete examples?
Well, think of them as leverage points,
Okay, leverage points.
Yeah, so marginalized groups are using them to, demand government action, to push for legal changes, and really to hold institutions accountable for upholding these rights.
Interesting. So they're really using the Constitution to kind of force the issue a little bit.
In a way, yes.
I like that. And speaking of forcing the issue, one of the sources had this really powerful example of resistance. It was a poem by Soirabai, a 14th century Mahar woman.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and she directly challenged the concept of purity, which was often used to justify the caste system.
Right.
There's this one line that really struck me. She says, "A body is unclean, they say. Only the soul is untainted. But the impurity of the body is born within the body."
Wow, that's powerful, especially considering the time period.
Yeah.
It shows that even centuries ago, people were pushing back against these social hierarchies.
Yeah, and the fact that her words still resonate today really underscores how relevant these issues remain. Like, we might have abolished untouchability officially, but clearly the legacy of that system is still there.
Absolutely. It's a long and complicated process of dismantling those deeply rooted beliefs and practices.
Totally. And that kind of brings us to another aspect of this fight for equality. And that's reservation policies, which, as the sources explain, are these policies intended to address the historical disadvantages faced by Dalits and Adivasis.
Yeah, it's essentially an attempt to level the playing field a bit.
So from what I understand, it's like allocating a certain percentage of seats in like educational institutions and government jobs specifically for these groups. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the basic idea.
Okay, so break it down for us. How do these reservations actually work? Like, who qualifies and how's it all implemented?
Well, it starts with these lists, maintained by both the central and state governments, and they're called the Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes lists.
Okay, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Got it.
Right. And if your particular caste or tribe is on one of those lists, then you're eligible to apply for those reserved positions.
Okay. But I imagine it's not just a free pass, right?
No, not at all. There are still qualifications that you need to meet and cutoff marks that apply.
I see. So you still got to earn it.
Absolutely.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But man, it sounds like such a complex system, Trying to balance historical disadvantage with individual merit. I imagine this sparks quite a bit of debate.
Oh, it absolutely does. And there are very valid arguments on both sides of the issue.
I bet.
Some people argue that reservations are absolutely essential, to rectify these historical injustices.
That makes sense.
Right, because they provide opportunities that might otherwise be completely inaccessible.
Sure.
But then on the other hand, you have people who worry about the potential for reverse discrimination, or they question the effectiveness of this approach.
Yeah, I can see both sides of that.
It's really a nuanced issue, so you need to understand the arguments and the historical context to really grasp the complexity.
Wow. So for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with the Indian context, Could you just briefly summarize what reservations are and why they're so controversial?
Sure. So basically, they're a form of affirmative action aimed at leveling the playing field for groups that have historically been disadvantaged.
Huh.
And it's controversial because it touches on those deep-seated social divisions,
Right.
ideas about meritocracy and the role of government, stepping in to address these historical wrongs.
Man, it sounds like even with the best intentions, finding the right solution to those really deeply rooted inequalities is just incredibly difficult.
Absolutely. There's no easy fix. It requires dialogue and critical thinking and a willingness to adapt.
Yeah, and it seems like that's where the legal battles come in, right?
Yeah.
Because the sources also talk about the Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Act of 1989.
The Prevention of Atrocities Act?
Right. So why was that act created? What was the context?
It was a direct response to the rising violence that was happening against Dalits and Adavasis.
Really?
Yeah, and especially as they started asserting their rights.
Wow.
You have to imagine the situation. You've got these constitutional guarantees, but on the ground, there's a huge backlash.
Yeah, I could see how that would happen.
So this act was really trying to address that.
That makes sense. And one of the sources mentions a story of this young man, Rathnam.
Oh, yes.
And it's kind of illustrating this need for legal protection. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, so Rathnam refused to perform this degrading ritual that his family had been forced to do for generations.
Oh, wow.
And they were forced to do it because they were Dalits.
Oh, God.
And his refusal was incredibly courageous, but it led to a huge backlash within his community.
So basically, the 1989 Act was created to protect people like Rathnam,
Exactly.
to define what constitutes an atrocity and, lay out those legal consequences.
Yep. And it's a really detailed piece of legislation. It lists all sorts of atrocities.
What kind of things are we talking about?
Oh, everything from physical violence and intimidation to economic exploitation and social humiliation.
Wow, that's a broad range.
And the punishments are quite severe, too, sending a very clear message.
It's like saying we're not going to tolerate this anymore. The sources mention some truly awful things like forcing someone to eat inedible substances or public stripping. It's hard to even imagine.
It's a stark reminder of what many Dalits and Adavasis still face.
Yeah, and I guess the intention of the act wasn't just to punish those specific offenders, but to kind of create this deterrent effect.
Absolutely.
To hopefully influence behavior and promote more respect and equality.
Ideally, yes.
Sounds like a really powerful tool.
Yeah.
But, as we've seen with other well-intentioned policies, sometimes the challenge is in the implementation.
Oh, for sure. You can have the best laws in the world, but if they're not enforced, it doesn't really matter.
Exactly. Laws provide a framework, but it's really the work of individuals and communities and organizations that drives that real social change.
Couldn't agree more.
And sometimes, even with legal protections in place, deeply entrenched social practices just prove incredibly difficult to eradicate.
It's a constant battle.
Yeah. Which brings us to another really disturbing issue that the sources brought up. Manual scavenging. This practice is still happening in India, even though it's officially banned.
Yeah, it's a tragic reality.
It's hard to believe something so inhumane still exists.
I know.
So manual scavenging, just to be clear, this is the practice of manually removing human waste.
That's it. And it's incredibly dangerous and dehumanizing.
And it's directly linked to the caste system.
Yeah. Almost exclusively carried out by Dalits. And often women. Because of that whole historical association with uncleanliness.
So even though untouchability is abolished, this practice persists.
It's a huge contradiction.
It shows that just abolishing something on paper doesn't mean it disappears from society.
Right. It takes so much more than that. It takes sustained effort, social change, and really dismantling those deep-rooted prejudices.
It's a reminder that the fight for equality is far from over. But before we dive into the specifics of trying to eradicate manual scavenging, can we take a step back and just define the practice a little bit more? What exactly is it and why is it tied to the caste system?
Of course. So manual scavenging, as we said, is the practice of removing human waste by hand from dry latrines and sewers.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah. Nobody wants to do this job. It's incredibly dangerous and it's dehumanizing. And as I mentioned, it's almost exclusively done by Dalits, especially women. And, it all goes back to that historical association with uncleanliness under the caste system.
So basically, even though untouchability is officially abolished,
Yeah.
the stigma and the practice persist in this horrific form.
Exactly. And it just goes to show how deep those social hierarchies run.
Yeah. And it's not for a lack of trying, right? Because
Yeah.
the sources mentioned that 1993 Act.
Right.
That specifically prohibits the practice of manual scavenging.
Mm-hmm.
And it even bans the construction of dry latrines. You know, the ones that often necessitate manual scavenging in the first place.
Yeah.
But clearly it still persists.
It does.
So I guess that's a pretty clear indication that laws alone aren't enough to change social norms.
Absolutely not.
So what other efforts have been made to address this, besides just passing that law?
Well, in 2003, the Safai Karamchari Andolan, which is an organization working with manual scavengers, they filed a public interest litigation, or a PIL, in the Supreme Court.
Okay, a PIL.
Yeah. And they were arguing that the government just wasn't doing enough to actually enforce the 1993 Act.
So they were calling them out, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. And they were saying, look, manual scavenging is still happening even within government institutions.
Oh, wow.
So, they were really trying to hold the government accountable.
That's bold. What happened? What was the outcome of that PIL?
Well, the Supreme Court in 2005 issued a pretty landmark ruling. They ordered all government departments to investigate.
To investigate what?
To see if manual scavenging was happening within their own ranks.
Oh, wow.
And if it was found, they were mandated to implement these time-bound rehabilitation programs for those workers.
So it wasn't just like a slap on the wrist.
No, they had to take real action.
That's great. That sounds like a real victory for the Safai Karamchari Andolan.
It was.
And for the workers themselves. But as we said before, this problem is so deeply entrenched.
It is.
It makes me wonder how you actually fully eradicate it. I mean, are there other legal developments that happened?
Yeah, so in 2013, another act was passed.
Okay.
And this one focused specifically on the rehabilitation of manual scavengers.
Okay, so rehabilitation, like helping them find different jobs and stuff?
Exactly. It aimed to provide alternative livelihoods, financial assistance and skill development programs.
Okay, so it wasn't just saying stop doing this.
Yeah.
It was trying to give them a way out.
Right. Because a lot of times people are trapped in these professions because they don't have other options.
Makes sense. So essentially we have all these laws.
We do.
And they all aim to eradicate this practice, but it's still a problem.
Right.
So what makes this issue so hard to solve? Like, why is it so persistent?
I mean, there are so many factors at play. You have that deeply ingrained social stigma, the whole association with uncleanliness and the caste system. So it's really hard to break that cycle of discrimination.
Yeah. And then, like you were saying, you also have the economic side of things.
Yeah.
Where people are stuck because they don't have other opportunities.
Exactly. And then on top of all that, you have enforcement, which can be pretty lax.
So the laws aren't always being followed.
Not as closely as they should be.
It seems like we need a multi-pronged approach then.
I think so.
Not just laws, but we need to address social attitudes and those economic disparities, and then really make sure that those laws are being implemented.
Absolutely. And I think that's why organizations like the Safai Karamchari Andolan are so crucial. They're doing incredible work on the ground, empowering those manual scavengers, advocating for their rights, and, providing them with resources.
Yeah, they're the ones really making a difference, I think.
They're doing the hard work.
For sure. And it highlights that role of civil society in pushing for social change. They're holding those institutions accountable.
Absolutely.
And it reminds me of another group we talked about, the Atabasis. The sources went into detail about their struggles to reclaim that ancestral land that was often taken over by non-tribal groups.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about the historical context of all of that? Like, how did that dispossession even happen?
Well, for centuries, Adivasi communities have been marginalized. They're indigenous to the Indian subcontinent.
Okay.
But their lands were taken over, for development projects, for mining, for all sorts of commercial ventures.
Wow. So it's like they were pushed aside to make room for progress.
Pretty much. And it resulted in widespread displacement and loss of livelihood and, disruption of their traditional way of life.
Which is so connected to the land.
Exactly.
And it seems like this isn't just a historical issue.
Unfortunately not.
It's still happening today.
Yeah. Even with laws that protect Adivasi land rights, they still face all sorts of challenges, like illegal land grabbing and forced evictions.
It's crazy to think that's still happening.
Yeah.
So how are they resisting all of this? The sources mentioned they're using some pretty interesting strategies.
Yeah, so one thing that really stands out is their use of the 1989 Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Act. the Prevention of Atrocities Act.
Wait, that same act we were just talking about.
The same one.
But that was about deletes.
I know.
So how are they using that for land rights?
Well, they're arguing that forced displacement from their ancestral lands that often involves violence and intimidation actually constitutes an atrocity under that act.
Oh, so they're kind of reframing it as a form of violence
Yeah.
specifically targeted at atabasis.
Exactly. It's really clever.
That's amazing. They're using this existing legal framework in this new way. It shows that the law can be a powerful tool, but sometimes you got to get creative.
You do, and it's not just about the legal battles either. They're engaging in protests, sit-ins, and they're reclaiming their land through direct action.
Wow. So they're fighting on multiple fronts.
Yeah.
And one of the sources quoted this Adivasi activist named C.K. Jano. And she criticizes the government for allowing exploitation of tribal lands for those commercial interests.
Yeah.
She says instead of facilitating this exploitation, they should be rehabilitating the displaced Adivasis.
And she's right. If you're going to displace these communities, you have a moral obligation to ensure their well-being.
To provide them with some sort of alternative.
Exactly. It's about social justice and human rights.
Okay, so we have these legal battles, grassroots activism, and then this call for accountability from the government. It seems like the Adivasi struggle is just so multifaceted.
It is. It's this ongoing fight for recognition and justice and the right to self-determination.
So we've covered a lot. You know, the Constitution, reservations, the Prevention of Atrocities Act, the fight against manual scavenging, and now this Adivasi struggle for land rights.
It's a lot to take in.
But the sources also mentioned another really important piece of legislation, the 2006 Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Act.
The Recognition of Forest Rights Act.
Right. What can you tell us about that?
It's a landmark piece of legislation, really, because it finally recognizes those historical rights of forest-dwelling communities to their land and resources.
Which includes many Adivasis rights.
Many of them, yeah. And for centuries, these communities have been treated as encroachers on forest land. Their traditional practices were criminalized and their rights denied.
It's like they were being punished for living in their own homes.
Pretty much. And this act tries to rectify that.
It sounds like a huge step forward.
Yeah.
So what rights does this act actually cover? What does it mean for Adivasis who have been living in these forests for generations?
Well, it recognizes their rights to homestead land.
Homestead land?
Yeah. So that's the land they occupy for their homes and gardens. It also recognizes cultivation areas where they practice traditional agriculture,
Okay.
grazing grounds for their livestock,
Yeah.
and access to non-timber forest products.
Which they need for their livelihoods.
Exactly. It's acknowledging their traditional practices, their way of life.
Which is so tied to the forest. So it's not just about land ownership, then it's about recognizing their right to live and sustainably manage the forest.
Exactly. It's a big shift in perspective, from viewing them as encroachers to seeing them as stewards of the forest.
I like that.
And it also acknowledges that traditional knowledge that they have, those sustainable practices.
So their knowledge is valuable.
It is.
Yeah.
And the act is finally recognizing that.
That's a really good step, I think.
It is. But like with any legislation, the real test is in implementation.
Right. So how effective has it been in actually protecting those rights?
Well, it has the potential to bring about real positive change, but the reality is it's complex. Implementation has been uneven. Some states are doing better than others, and there are still challenges.
Like what?
Awareness.
Yeah.
A lot of forest dwellers just don't even know their rights.
Oh, wow.
And then there are all these bureaucratic hurdles in the claims process.
So even if they know their rights, it can be hard to actually get them recognized.
Exactly. And then you also have resistance from those who benefit from the status quo.
The people who are profiting off of this exploitation.
Yeah.
So it seems like the struggle continues,
It does.
even with this progress. It kind of feels like a recurring theme in our conversation today,
What's that?
that legal frameworks are super important, but they're just one piece of the puzzle.
Right. It takes so much more than just laws to create real change.
Absolutely. It takes that grassroots activism, social awareness, and the political will to actually get things done.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And that brings us to our next topic, which is, what are those different strategies that marginalized groups are using to challenge inequality?
Yeah.
But I think before we dive into that, maybe we should pause for a moment.
Yeah, catch our breath.
We covered so much ground.
We have. From constitutional rights to grassroots activism, legal battles, collective action.
It's a lot.
It is. But it's so important to understand the historical context and those legal frameworks and the challenges that these communities are up against.
It's all connected.
It is.
So in our final segment, we're going to look at the agency and resilience of these communities.
Because they're not just passive victims.
No, they're actively fighting for their rights and dignity.
Exact.
So stay tuned, everybody. We'll be right back. All right, so we're back and ready to dive into that last part of our exploration.
Yes. And it's a crucial part, I think, because we've talked a lot about the challenges, but now it's time to shift that focus to the agency and resilience of these marginalized communities.
Right. They're not just sitting back and taking it.
No, not at all. They're actively fighting for their rights and dignity.
And they're using some pretty clever and creative strategies to do it.
They are.
So let's dig into those strategies a bit. What are some of the things these groups are doing to challenge inequality and bring about social change?
Well, one example we talked about earlier was that use of the 1989 Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Act, the Prevention of Atrocities Act,
Right.
the Adivasi activists using that to protect their land rights.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
It's such a brilliant example of legal activism, you know?
It is.
It shows how these groups can use existing legal frameworks.
In new ways.
Yeah, in really innovative ways to challenge those in power.
And it's not just about being creative with the law either.
No, definitely not.
It's about understanding it,
Right.
knowing how it works,
Knowing the ins and outs.
and then using that knowledge strategically.
To fight for justice. And the sources also emphasize grassroots organizing and community mobilization,
Oh, absolutely.
building those alliances.
Because there's strength in numbers.
For sure. When marginalized groups come together, they can really amplify their voices.
And they create a much stronger platform to advocate for change.
And it makes them harder to ignore.
It does.
So do we have any examples of this kind of collective action?
Oh, tons. But one that comes to mind is the Safai Kormchari Andolan.
Oh, yeah. The group working with manual scavengers.
Exactly. They've done incredible work mobilizing communities, organizing protests, and they even engage in strategic litigation. So they're working on all those different fronts we were talking about.
They are. And they've brought national attention to this issue.
And pushed for those policy changes.
Yeah, they really demonstrate what collective action can achieve.
It's inspiring
It is.
to see what can happen when people band together. And it's not just about working with other marginalized communities either, right?
Yeah.
It's also about engaging with allies from dominant groups. People who are willing to use their privilege to support these movements.
That's crucial.
Because we need everyone on board if we're going to create a truly inclusive and equitable society.
And that means building bridges across those social divides.
Right, dismantling those systems of oppression that hold everyone back.
And it starts with recognizing that we're all interconnected.
And that our struggles are often linked.
They are. And it's about fostering empathy and understanding.
And being willing to challenge our own biases.
And privileges, yeah. It's not always easy, but it's necessary work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because ultimately we're trying to create a society where everyone's rights and dignity are respected.
Exactly. Regardless of their background.
And it makes me think about the power of education.
Oh, yes. Education is key.
It's not just about literacy or vocational skills.
No, it's about so much more than that.
It's about critical thinking. It's about awareness raising.
Giving people the tools to challenge those oppressive systems.
It's about empowering individuals
Yeah.
to understand their rights,
Develop their voice.
to become agents of change in their own communities.
Yes. It's about fostering agency and helping people break free from those cycles of marginalization.
And equipping them with the knowledge and the skills and the confidence to demand better.
To demand their rights and to envision a more just and equitable society.
And I think that's what this whole deep dive has been about, really. Exploring those complexities of marginalization, the resilience of those fighting for justice, and that potential for social transformation.
Beautifully said.
So to our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey.
It's been such a pleasure exploring these issues with you.
We've covered a lot of ground, from constitutional rights to grassroots activism to those legal battles and the power of collective action. It's been quite a ride.
It has. And we hope this conversation has sparked your curiosity and deepened your understanding.
And maybe even inspired you to continue engaging with these crucial topics.
Because the fight for equality and justice is ongoing.
And we all have a role to play in creating a society where everyone can live with dignity and have their voices heard. So thank you for listening and keep fighting the good fight.